Three ruthless drifters walk into a frontier church, demanding the priest's silver cross. They don't realize he was once known as the Confessor, the deadliest gunslinger west of the Mississippi, whose bullets sent 47 souls to their final judgment. Some say he never missed a shot or failed to offer a prayer for his victims. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thunder rolled across the drought-stricken plains of New Mexico territory as Father Thomas Morrison completed his evening prayers. The small wooden church of St. Michael's stood alone on the outskirts of Redemption Springs, its weathered cross casting a long shadow in the setting sun. The year was 1875, and like many frontier towns, Redemption Springs teetered between civilization and lawlessness, its dusty streets witnessing both acts of charity and unspeakable violence. Father Morrison's calloused hands, unsuited for handling delicate prayer beads, moved with practiced precision as he arranged the altar for Sunday service. 10 years had passed since he'd last touched a revolver, but time hadn't softened the gunfighter's calluses. His fingers traced the intricate carvings on the altar, each groove a reminder of the life he'd chosen to leave behind. The doors of his church remained open to all, though few in town knew why their priest's eyes carried such weight when he spoke of redemption. The evening air hung heavy with the promise of rain, a rare blessing in these parts. Morrison paused his preparations to light the church's lanterns, their warm glow creating dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Each Sunday he would stand before his congregation, offering words of peace and forgiveness, all while carrying the burden of 47 souls whose final moments had come at his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him, a man who had once been death's messenger, now serving as a shepherd of life. The first drops of rain began to fall as three horses approached from the east, their hoofbeats muffled by the softening earth. Their riders, dust-covered and armed, had left a trail of violence across 3 territories. Samuel "Snake Eyes" Clayton and the McGrath brothers had earned their reputation through robbery and murder, always targeting the seemingly defenseless. Their latest scheme involved relieving various churches of their valuables, with a particular interest in religious artifacts they could sell to collectors back east. 4 other churches had already fallen victim to their predations, with 2 priests in the ground for resisting. The sound of spurs on wooden steps broke the evening silence. Father Morrison didn't turn from his work, even as the church doors creaked open. The smell of wet leather and gunpowder filled the air as the 3 men entered, spreading out in a familiar pattern that spoke of experience in confrontation. Morrison's peripheral vision caught their movements, Snake Eyes taking center, the McGrath brothers flanking left and right. It was the same formation he himself had used countless times in another life. "Evening, Father," Snake Eyes called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that had preceded many acts of violence. "Mighty fine cross you got there on that altar. Pure silver, if I ain't mistaken." His boots left muddy prints on the recently swept floor, each step a deliberate desecration. Father Morrison's hands stilled on the altar cloth, feeling the weight of the moment. "The church is open to all who seek guidance," he responded, his voice carrying the peculiar accent of someone who had traveled far and changed much. "But I sense you haven't come for prayers." His words hung in the air like the distant thunder, a warning wrapped in civility. The youngest McGrath brother laughed, running his finger along a wooden pew. "Ain't that the truth? Way we hear it, this here church has been collecting tithes from silver miners. Figure that makes you a wealthy man of God." His voice had the high pitch of youth, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a killer. Finally turning, Father Morrison revealed a face weathered by sun and marked by a thin scar running along his left jaw. A souvenir from a life he'd left behind. His black cassock couldn't quite hide the way he carried himself, the stance of a man who had spent years keeping his balance in quick-draw situations. To an untrained eye, he appeared as any other frontier priest, perhaps a bit more weathered than most, but to those who knew what to look for, there were signs. The way his right hand never strayed far from his side, the calculated positioning that kept him within reach of the pulpit, the steady gaze that seemed to measure distances even as it offered peace. "Whatever wealth this church has belongs to those in need," Morrison stated calmly, though his eyes carefully tracked each man's position. "I suggest you seek your fortunes elsewhere." Each word was measured, offered as much in hope as warning. He had seen too many young men choose the path of violence, had helped many along that dark road himself in his previous life. Snake Eyes stepped forward, moonlight from the window glinting off his silver-plated revolvers. "Now see, that's where you're wrong, Father. We ain't asking." His hand moved to his gun belt, fingers dancing near the pearl handle. "That cross, any coins you've collected, and maybe we don't have to find out if God's ready to receive one of his shepherds." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the church's interior through the stained glass windows. For a brief moment, Father Morrison's shadow on the wall seemed to shift, taking on the familiar silhouette of a gunfighter's stance. The moment passed quickly, but something in the priest's eyes made Snake Eyes hesitate, a fleeting glimpse of something hard and deadly beneath the peaceful exterior. "I've given last rites to many men," Morrison said softly, each word weighted with memory. "Some died peaceful, some violent, but all faced judgment in the end." His right hand remained relaxed at his side, though decades of instinct mapped the distance to the worn Bible on the pulpit, and what was hidden within its hollowed-out pages. "It's not too late to walk away from this path." The older McGrath brother, growing impatient, drew his pistol. "Enough preaching! Either hand over that cross, or—" Before he could finish his threat, a gust of wind blew through the church, extinguishing several candles. In the sudden darkness, Father Morrison's expression changed, years of practiced peace giving way to something harder, more familiar. He had worked hard to leave behind the man known as the Confessor. But sometimes the past demanded acknowledgement. In the shadows of his church, surrounded by men who had chosen the path he'd abandoned, Morrison faced a choice between his past and his prayers. The question wasn't whether he could still draw faster than these men. The question was whether he should, and what it would cost his soul to once again become the person he'd spent a decade trying to bury through prayer and penance. Thunder crashed outside as Snake Eyes' hand tightened on his revolver, unaware that he was about to make the deadliest mistake of his life. The first shot shattered both the silence and the large stained glass window behind the altar, sending fragments of colored glass cascading to the floor like a rainbow in ruins. Father Morrison moved with a speed that belonged to his past life, diving behind the sturdy oak pulpit as two more shots splintered the wood where he had stood moments before. The hollow Bible, disturbed by his movement, fell open, revealing its secret. A meticulously maintained cult peacemaker, its blued steel still gleaming despite years of concealment. "Check the back door!" Snake Eyes barked at the younger McGrath, his voice tight with the sudden realization that this wasn't going to be as simple as their previous church robberies. The sound of boots on wooden floorboards echoed through the church as the youngest brother moved to comply, his own gun drawn and shaking slightly. Thunder continued to roll outside, and through the broken window came the sound of rain intensifying, drumming against the church roof like distant gunfire. Father Morrison's hand hovered over the peacemaker, memories flooding back of countless similar moments. But this time was different. This time he had sworn an oath not just to man, but to God. "Last chance," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of both pulpit and pistol. "Leave now. Return what you've stolen from the other churches and seek absolution for your sins." He could hear Snake Eyes' low chuckle in response, followed by the subtle sound of a hammer being cocked. "Ain't that something?" Snake Eyes drawled, his boots creaking on the wooden floor as he sought a better angle. "A man of God making threats. Tell me, Father, what would your flock think if they saw their shepherd reaching for iron instead of scripture?" The older McGrath brother had worked his way around to the side, trying to flank Morrison's position. "Just shoot him, Snake. He's just another preacher playing at being brave. They all break in the end." Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer. When he opened them again, his decision was made. "You're wrong about one thing," he said, his voice carrying a tone his congregation had never heard. "I'm not playing at anything." In one fluid motion that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, Morrison grasped the peacemaker and rolled to his left, coming up in a shooter's crouch that had been muscle memory long before he learned to genuflect. His first shot caught the older McGrath brother in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the floor. The second shot disarmed Snake Eyes before the man could even register that Morrison had moved. The youngest McGrath, hearing the gunfire, came running back from the rear of the church, firing wildly. His shots went wide, one striking a painting of the crucifixion, another embedding itself in the ceiling beam above. Morrison's return fire was precise, one shot to the boy's gun hand, causing him to drop his weapon with a cry of pain. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the continuing storm outside, Father Morrison stood slowly. The peacemaker in his hand looked as natural as a rosary, a fact that brought him no joy. The scent of gunpowder mixed with incense created an oddly fitting perfume for this moment of judgment. "You should have listened," Morrison said quietly, moving to secure their weapons. "Violence begets violence, but mercy—" He paused, checking the wounds he had inflicted, ensuring none were fatal. "Mercy is a choice we must make again and again." Snake Eyes, clutching his bleeding hand, stared at Morrison with dawning recognition. "Wait, the way you shoot. The voice. You're him, ain't you? The Confessor." His face had gone pale, either from blood loss or fear. "They said you died in a gunfight in Dodge City years ago." "The Confessor did die that day," Morrison replied, beginning to tend to their wounds with supplies from the church's medical kit. "God saw fit to grant me a new purpose." He worked methodically, cleaning and bandaging each injury, just as he had done countless times in his previous life, though back then he had usually been the cause of more serious wounds. The younger McGrath, tears streaming down his face, looked up at Morrison. Why didn't you kill us? You could have." Morrison paused in his ministrations, considering the question. The answer was something he had spent 10 years coming to understand. Because death is easy, redemption, true redemption, that's the harder path. He finished bandaging the last wound and stood, the peacemaker now tucked away in his cassock. And sometimes those who most deserve death are the ones most in need of a chance at redemption. The storm outside had begun to ease, and through the broken window came the first hints of dawn. Morrison looked at the three men, now disarmed and bandaged, and made another decision. "The sheriff will be here soon. Until then, we're going to talk about the path you're on and where it leads." He moved to relight the candles that had been extinguished during the fight. "And you're going to tell me about the other churches you robbed and the men you killed." As he struck a match, the flame's glow reflected in his eyes, showing both the steel of the gunfighter he had been and the compassion of the priest he had become. Consider this your first confession. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sheriff Marcus Wade arrived at St. Michael's Church just as the morning sun began to pierce through the storm clouds. The aftermath of the night's violence was evident in the shattered stained glass, bullet-scarred walls, and the three subdued men sitting in the front pew, their wounds professionally bandaged. Father Morrison stood at the pulpit, calmly reading from his Bible as if it were any other morning. "Quite a mess you've got here, Father," Wade observed, his spurs clicking against the wooden floor as he surveyed the scene. The sheriff was a tall man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. He'd been in Redemption Springs for 15 years, long enough to remember when the town lived up to neither part of its name. Morrison closed his Bible with deliberate care. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Sheriff. These men came seeking material wealth, but found something else entirely." His voice carried the same serene tone he used during Sunday services, though there was something else there, something that made Wade study him more carefully. Snake Eyes, his bandaged hand cradled in his lap, spoke up with an edge of desperate revelation in his voice. "Sheriff, you ain't gonna believe who this priest really is. He's—" Before he could finish, Morrison's glance silenced him more effectively than any threat of violence could have. "These men have confessed to a series of church robberies across the territory," Morrison interrupted smoothly, "including the murders of Father Michael Collins in Santa Fe and Father James Roberts in Albuquerque. They're prepared to return what they've stolen and face earthly judgment for their crimes." Wade's hand instinctively moved to rest on his gun belt. "That's so? Been tracking those murders for months." He looked at the three wounded men with newfound interest. "Though I have to wonder, Father, how exactly you convinced these notorious outlaws to have such a change of heart." The younger McGrath brother, still pale from his injury and the night's events, spoke in a trembling voice. "He showed us mercy, Sheriff. Could have killed us all, but he chose not to." His eyes darted to Morrison with a mixture of fear and awe. "Never seen anything like it." "Mercy!" Wade's eyebrows rose as he took in the bullet holes in the walls, all precisely placed. "Seems to me there was more than just mercy at work here." He moved closer to Morrison, lowering his voice. "You know, Father, something about the way these shots were placed reminds me of stories I used to hear about a gunfighter they called the Confessor." Morrison met Wade's gaze steadily. "The past is a foreign country, Sheriff. We all have one, but it's the present that defines us." He gestured to the wounded men. "These three have chosen to step off their dark path. That's what matters now." The older McGrath brother shifted uncomfortably on the pew. "We'll tell you everything, Sheriff. About the robberies, the killings, all of it, just—" He glanced at Morrison. "Just let us make our peace with God first." Wade studied Morrison for a long moment. "The Confessor was said to have dropped out of sight near Dodge City about 10 years back. Same time you came to town, if I recall correctly." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Some said he'd found religion. Others said he'd met his match in a gunfight. Perhaps both are true in their own way," Morrison replied quietly. "Death and rebirth often walk hand in hand." He moved to straighten a toppled candlestick, his movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had never fully forgotten how to dance with death. The sheriff nodded slowly, years of frontier wisdom showing in his weathered face. "You know, Father, this territory's changing. Laws getting stronger, but there's still those who only respect the gun." He gestured to the prisoners. "I'll take these three in, but word of what happened here will spread." "Then let them speak of mercy rather than violence," Morrison said, though his hand unconsciously moved to touch the hidden peacemaker beneath his cassock. "Let them tell of choices and chances for redemption. And if others come, men looking to make a name for themselves by challenging the priest who tamed Snake Eyes, Clayton, and the McGrath brothers." Morrison's face showed a flicker of the weight he carried. "Then I will pray they choose a better path. And if they don't—" He left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning hung in the air like gunsmoke. As Wade began to lead the prisoners out, Snake Eyes turned back. "Father, about that confession, Your secrets are between you and God, Morrison assured him. Though I suggest you think carefully about the path ahead of you, redemption is never easy, but it's always possible. The morning sun finally broke through fully, sending shafts of light through the broken window and casting prismatic patterns across the bullet-scarred walls. Morrison watched them leave, knowing that today's events would send ripples through the territory. The Confessor's ghost had stirred, and there would be consequences. He picked up his worn Bible, running his fingers over the cover. Inside, the hollowed-out space holding his peacemaker felt heavier than usual. The path of peace was never simple for a man who had once dealt in death, but it was the path he had chosen. Now he would have to walk it more carefully than ever. Word of the previous night's events spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire in drought season. By midday, the dusty main street had become unusually crowded with onlookers hoping to catch a glimpse of the priest who had outdrawn Snake Eyes Clayton and the McGrath brothers. The Long Branch Saloon, situated directly across from St. Michael's Church, had never done better business. Father Morrison went about his duties as if nothing had changed, though he noted the way conversations stopped when he passed by. The broken window of his church had been temporarily boarded up, and he worked steadily to clean the aftermath of the night's violence. Each bullet hole he discovered in the walls felt like a personal failure, not of skill, but of his vow to leave violence behind. "They're saying you're the Confessor," a voice said from the church doorway. Morrison turned to find Sarah Mackenzie, the town's schoolteacher, standing there with concern evident in her green eyes. She'd been one of his most devoted parishioners since his arrival in Redemption Springs, though now uncertainty colored her usually confident demeanor. "People say many things, Miss Mackenzie," Morrison replied, continuing to sweep up fragments of colored glass, "especially in times of excitement." Sarah stepped inside, her skirts rustling against the wooden floor. "I remember the stories about the Confessor. They said he would offer a prayer for every man he killed, that he could shoot a playing card edge on at 20 paces. She paused, watching him work. They also said he disappeared after gunning down 12 men in a single day in Dodge City. Morrison's hands stilled on the broom handle. "The past is full of stories, Miss Mackenzie. Some true, some false, most somewhere in between." He looked up at the crude wooden cross, now visible through the boarded window. "What matters is who a person chooses to be today." "I agree," Sarah said softly, "but you should know, James Blackjack Turner arrived on the noon stage. He's in the Long Branch now, telling everyone who'll listen that he's going to call you out." Morrison's expression remained neutral, but his grip on the broom tightened imperceptibly. Blackjack Turner had been making a name for himself across the territory, challenging and killing men with fearsome reputations. He'd already killed 3 former lawmen and 1 retired Texas Ranger, always operating just within the bounds of what passed for law in the territory. "The Lord teaches us to turn the other cheek," Morrison said, though his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there moments before. "And if he doesn't give you that choice?" Sarah pressed. "They say he forced his last victim to draw by shooting the man's wife in the leg. He's not just looking for a reputation anymore. He enjoys the killing." Before Morrison could respond, heavy bootfalls announced another visitor. Sheriff Wade entered the church, his expression grave. "Father thought you should hear this from me. Turner's in town." "So I've heard," Morrison replied, finally setting the broom aside. "Has he broken any laws yet?" Wade shook his head. "He knows better, but he's been asking questions about last night, about you. Says he knew the Confessor once, claims you moved exactly like him when you took down Clayton and the McGraths." "Many men of violence share similar habits," Morrison observed quietly. "It proves nothing." "Maybe not," Wade agreed. "But he's offering $5,000 to anyone who can prove you're the Confessor. Says if you are, you owe him a reckoning for his brother's death in Dodge City." Sarah gasped softly. "Surely you won't accept such a challenge, Father." Morrison moved to the pulpit, running his fingers along the worn wood. "A shepherd's duty is to protect his flock, Miss Mackenzie. Sometimes that means standing firm against the wolves." He turned to Wade. "Where is Turner now?" "Still holding court in the Long Branch. He's got 3 men with him, all wearing guns. Says he'll call you out at sunset." Wade's hand rested on his own gun. "I could try to run him out of town." "No," Morrison said firmly. "That would only lead to more bloodshed. I'll speak with him myself." "Father, please." Sarah stepped forward. "You're a man of God now. No one expects you to face a gunfighter." Morrison smiled gently. "We're all God's children, Miss Mackenzie, even men like Turner." He reached for his hat, worn and black like his cassock. "Sometimes the hardest part of being a shepherd is knowing when to use the staff and when to use the rod." As he stepped out into the harsh afternoon sun, Morrison felt the weight of the peacemaker concealed beneath his clothes. The street cleared before him as he walked, townsfolk pressing themselves against buildings or ducking into doorways. The distance to the Long Branch seemed both longer and shorter than usual. Behind him, Sarah turned to Wade. "Sheriff, you know who he really is, don't you?" Wade watched Morrison's measured stride toward the saloon. "I know he's a good man trying to be better. Sometimes that's all we need to know." He adjusted his gun belt. "But I think we're about to find out if a man can truly change his nature, or if some pasts can't be outrun, no matter how far you ride." The Long Branch saloon fell silent as Father Morrison entered, his black cassock seeming to absorb what little light filtered through the dust-streaked windows. James Blackjack Turner sat at a corner table, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. He was younger than Morrison had expected, perhaps 35, with cold eyes that had watched too many men die. 3 armed men flanked Turner's table, their hands hovering near their weapons. Morrison recognized one of them, Marcus Hawkins, a hired gun known for his quick trigger finger and complete lack of conscience. The other 2 were unknowns, but their stance and the wear patterns on their holsters spoke of experience with violence. "Well, well," Turner drawled, rising slowly from his chair. "The shepherd leaves his flock to visit the wolves." He was dressed entirely in black, a mirror image of Morrison's attire, though his clothes were adorned with silver buttons that gleamed like fallen stars. Or should I say, the Confessor finally shows himself. Morrison remained by the entrance, his hands folded before him in a pose of peaceful contemplation that also, coincidentally, kept his right hand near his concealed weapon. "I'm simply a parish priest, Mr. Turner, though I hear you've been spreading some rather elaborate tales about me." The saloon's other patrons pressed themselves against the walls, trying to become invisible. The bartender, old Pete Wilson, slowly reached beneath the bar, where he kept a scattergun. Turner noticed and smiled coldly. "I wouldn't, Pete. My men are jumpy, and accidents happen." Morrison took 3 measured steps forward, drawing Turner's attention back to him. "I understand you're offering a substantial reward for information about the Confessor. That's quite a lot of money just to satisfy curiosity." "Curiosity?" Turner's smile vanished. 10 years ago in Dodge City, the Confessor gunned down my brother Matthew, shot him through the heart while he was reaching for a dropped pocket watch, not his gun. His voice carried the weight of a decade's hatred. Before he died, Matthew told me how the Confessor knelt beside him, offered a prayer for his soul, said it was the last thing he heard. The saloon seemed to grow darker as storm clouds gathered outside once again. Morrison studied Turner's face, seeing the familial resemblance to a man he had indeed prayed over many years ago. If I remember the stories correctly, Matthew Turner had killed 3 women and a child during a bank robbery in Wichita the week before. "So you do remember?" Turner's hand moved closer to his gun. "I knew it was you the moment I heard about last night. The Confessor had a particular way of shooting to wound rather than kill when it suited him, just like you did with Clayton and the McGraths." Morrison sighed deeply, the sound carrying the weight of years. "The past is full of graves, Mr. Turner, some marked, some not. What purpose does digging them up serve?" "Justice," Turner spat the word, "or revenge. They look mighty similar from where I stand." He pushed his untouched whiskey aside. "I'm calling you out, Confessor, at sunset in the street, unless you'd prefer I start visiting your congregation one by one until you find your courage." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Morrison felt the familiar calm settling over him, the strange peace that had always come before violence. "Your quarrel is with me, Mr. Turner. These people are innocent." "Like my brother was innocent?" Turner's voice rose. "You judged him guilty and appointed yourself executioner. Now I'm going to do the same to you." He leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "Or maybe I start with that pretty school teacher who was so concerned about you earlier." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Morrison's next words came out soft, but carried to every corner of the saloon. 10 years ago, I left behind a life of violence, took vows to serve God and my fellow man. I pray daily for forgiveness for the lives I took, including your brothers." His eyes met Turner's, and something in them made the younger man step back slightly. "But if you threaten my congregation, if you bring violence to those under my protection, then may God have mercy on your soul. Because I won't." The threat was delivered with the same tone Morrison used for Sunday sermons, making it all the more chilling. Hawkins and the other gunmen shifted uncomfortably, sensing something dangerous awakening in the seemingly humble priest. Turner recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Sunset, then, Confessor. One way or another we'll see what kind of man you really are." He gestured to his men, and they began backing toward the door. "Oh, and don't bother with a prayer when I kill you. I stopped believing in God the day you killed my brother." As they left, old Pete finally let out the breath he'd been holding. "Father, what are you going to do?" Morrison stood in silence for a long moment, watching the street through the saloon's window. "I'm going to pray, Pete. Pray for guidance. Pray for strength." He turned toward the door, his face set in grim determination. "And then I'm going to do what I have to do to protect my flock." Thunder rolled in the distance as Morrison stepped back into the street. The coming sunset would bring either redemption or damnation, and he wasn't sure which frightened him more. Father Morrison knelt before the altar of St. Michael's Church, his weathered hands clasped in prayer. The afternoon light filtering through the boarded-up window cast strange shadows across the bullet-scarred walls, a testament to how quickly peace could shatter. Behind him, the church door opened and closed softly, followed by the measured footsteps of Sheriff Wade. "The Turner gang's taken rooms at the hotel," Wade reported, his voice respectfully quiet in the sacred space. "Hawkins and the others are buying drinks for anyone willing to talk about you. They're building quite a story about the Confessor's exploits." Morrison remained kneeling, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what stories are they telling, Sheriff? That the Confessor once shot a man's gun hand off at 60 paces, that he killed 12 men in Dodge City without reloading his weapon, that he could shoot a man then save his life with medical skills learned in the war." Wade paused, moving closer to the altar. "Some of those stories sound far-fetched. Others, well, I've seen how you tend to the sick and wounded." Finally rising, Morrison turned to face the sheriff. The afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, marking the decade that had passed since he'd last worn the name of the Confessor. "During the war, I served as both a field medic and a sharpshooter. The skills seemed complementary at the time. Wound a man, then save him, keeping him alive to suffer longer. It took me years to understand the cruelty in that mercy. Wade leaned against a pew, studying the priest carefully. Turner's not going to back down. He's built his whole reputation on killing famous gunmen. Taking down the Confessor would make him a legend. We all build our lives on something, Sheriff. The question is whether the foundation can bear the weight. Morrison moved to the pulpit, running his fingers along the worn wood where his Bible usually rested. I built my first life on violence, measuring my worth in notches on a gun. When that foundation crumbled, I nearly went with it. The sound of raised voices drifted in from the street. Turner's men, already deep in their cups. Morrison continued, his voice taking on the cadence of confession. In Dodge City, after Matthew Turner died, I knelt beside him just as his brother said. But it wasn't just to pray. I wanted to watch the light leave his eyes, wanted him to know who had sent him to judgment. That's when I realized what I had become. A man protecting others from evil isn't the same as a man who kills for pleasure, Wade offered. Morrison shook his head slowly. The line between justice and vengeance is thinner than a communion wafer, Sheriff. I had started by hunting truly evil men, but by the end, he trailed off, lost in memory. Matthew Turner was reaching for a pocket watch, just as his brother said. I saw the glint of metal and fired without hesitation, without mercy, without true justice. Sarah Mackenzie appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern. Father, some of Turner's men are harassing your congregation. They're turning people away from the church, saying anyone who associates with you is choosing sides. Morrison's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The church remains open to all, Miss Mackenzie, even those who would threaten others. He reached beneath his cassock, withdrawing the peacemaker and placing it on the pulpit. The well-maintained weapon seemed to absorb the light, as black as his vestments. You can't face them all alone, Sarah protested. The territory marshal's office is only 2 days' ride. Sheriff Wade could send for help. In 2 days, how many might suffer for my past? Morrison's voice carried the weight of responsibility. No, this must end today. If I run now, Turner will only follow, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. Sometimes a shepherd must stand and face the wolves, no matter the cost to himself. Wade straightened, his hand falling to his own weapon. Then let me help. I'm still the law here. No, old friend, this is my burden to bear. Morrison picked up the peacemaker, checking it with practiced hands before concealing it once more. But I would ask one favor of each of you. Anything, Sarah said quickly, while Wade nodded his agreement. Sheriff, ensure the street is clear at sunset. I'll not have innocents caught in the crossfire. Morrison's voice grew softer. And Miss Mackenzie, would you lead the congregation in prayer? Not for victory, but for wisdom. For the strength to do what's right, not what's easy. Sarah wiped away a tear. Of course, Father, but will you tell us the truth? Are you truly the Confessor? Morrison looked toward the broken window where the afternoon sun continued its inexorable descent toward the horizon. By sunset, Miss Mackenzie, I fear everyone will know exactly who and what I am. May God have mercy on us all. The afternoon wore on, like a fever dream in Redemption Springs. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another storm. Inside the Long Branch saloon, Marcus Hawkins watched Father Morrison through the window as the priest made his way down the street, stopping to speak with each member of his congregation he encountered. Each conversation ended with the same pattern: a gentle word, a touched shoulder, a blessing given. He's saying goodbye, Hawkins muttered, more to himself than to the others. He'd seen that behavior before, in men who knew they were walking toward their final sunset. Turner, cleaning his prized ivory-handled revolver at a corner table, looked up with cold interest. The mighty Confessor, preparing for his final judgment, Turner sneered, though something in his voice betrayed uncertainty. Tell me, Hawkins, you've seen him shoot. Should I be worried? Hawkins turned from the window, choosing his words carefully. He'd witnessed the previous night's events from the shadows, drawn by rumors of Snake Eyes, Clayton's latest scheme. What he'd seen had kept him awake all night. "Boss, I've watched a lot of men handle guns. Some are naturally gifted, some are well-practiced, and some are just plain lucky. But last night—" He paused, taking a long drink of whiskey. "Last night I saw something different." "Different how?" Turner's hand stilled on his weapon. The way he moved, the way he placed his shots, it wasn't just skill. It was like watching a man speak his native tongue after years of silence. Every motion was perfect, practiced thousands of times, but there was something else too, something I ain't seen before. Outside, Morrison had stopped at the general store. Through the window, they could see him purchasing candles to replace those broken in the previous night's violence. The simple act somehow made him seem more dangerous, not less. "What you're seeing is a man who's lost his edge," Turner declared, but his voice lacked conviction. 10 years of soft living, playing at being holy. He's not the same man who killed my brother. The youngest of Turner's men, a red-headed youth called Irish Mike, spoke up from his position by the door. "Then why's everyone in town looking at him like he's a rattler about to strike?" Before Turner could respond, the saloon's batwing doors swung open and Sheriff Wade entered. The lawman's face was set in grim lines as he surveyed the room. "Gentlemen, just here to make something clear. When sunset comes, I want the street cleared of civilians. Whatever happens between Turner and Father Morrison, no one else needs to get hurt." Turner smiled thinly. "Awful specific timing you're acknowledging there, Sheriff. Almost like you know something's going to happen." "I know what's been brewing since you rode in," Wade replied evenly. "I also know that if any of your men interfere, or if any innocent people get caught in the crossfire, I'll hunt you to the ends of the territory." And his hand rested casually on his gun belt. "We understand each other?" Hawkins watched the exchange with growing unease. He'd seen his share of showdowns, but something about this one felt different. The pressure in the air reminded him of the moments before a tornado, nature holding its breath before unleashing hell. "Tell me something, Sheriff," Turner said, rising slowly. "You've known who he is all this time, haven't you? Been harboring a known killer right here in your town, letting him play at being righteous." Wade's expression remained neutral. "What I know is that Father Morrison has been a blessing to this community. He's tended our sick, buried our dead, and given hope to those who had none. Whatever he might have been before, that's who he is now." "A man can't change his nature," Turner insisted. "You hand a wolf a shepherd's crook, it's still a wolf." "Maybe," Wade conceded. "But I've seen him choose mercy when he could have chosen violence. Seen him bring peace where others would have brought war." The sheriff's eyes hardened. "Course, you seem determined to make him choose violence today." Turner laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm just helping him remember who he really is. By sunset, everyone will see the Confessor for what he truly is, a killer hiding behind a collar." Careful what you wish for," Wade said softly, turning to leave. "Some revelations come at a terrible price." As the sheriff's bootsteps faded, Hawkins returned to his window vigil. Morrison was now standing before his church, speaking with Sarah Mackenzie. Even at this distance, there was something in the priest's bearing that made Hawkins's gunfighter instincts scream warnings. "Boss," he said carefully, "maybe we should reconsider this." Turner's response was the sound of his gun being holstered with lethal finality. "The only thing I'm reconsidering is whether to make it quick or slow when I send him to meet his maker." The sun continued its westward journey, shadows lengthening across Redemption Springs like God's own countdown to judgment. With 2 hours remaining until sunset, Father Morrison sat in the church's small back room, methodically cleaning the peacemaker. Each component was dismantled with practiced efficiency, each piece wiped clean with the same care he usually reserved for communion vessels. The familiar ritual brought no comfort today, only memories of countless similar moments before violence erupted. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, continuing his work. Sarah Mackenzie stepped inside, carrying a leather-bound journal. "I found this in the church records," she said, placing the book on his simple wooden desk. "It's from your predecessor, Father Michael Andrews. His last entry. It's about you." Morrison's hands stilled on the weapon. "I remember Father Andrews. He was here when I first arrived in Redemption Springs, seeking sanctuary." Sarah opened the journal, reading aloud. "Today a man came to our church, his clothes black with trail dust and his eyes haunted by ghosts I dare not name. He calls himself the Confessor, though he seeks confession more than he offers it. I have heard of this man, who in these territories has not? But the stories speak of death and judgment, not of the broken soul I see before me." Morrison resumed cleaning his weapon, though his movements were slower now, more deliberate. Sarah continued reading. "He asks not for absolution, but for a chance to change, to serve rather than destroy. Though church law forbids ordained priests from carrying weapons, I believe God has led this warrior to our door for a purpose. Perhaps in these wild lands we need shepherds who know how to fight the wolves." "Father Andrews was a wise man," Morrison said softly. "Perhaps too wise in his judgment of me." "There's more." Sarah turned the page. He writes, "I have recommended Thomas Morrison for ordination, though I have not revealed his true identity to the bishop. Some secrets belong to God alone. I pray that in time he will find the peace he seeks, though I fear his past will never fully release him." Morrison reassembled the peacemaker with fluid motions that spoke of decades of practice. "Father Andrews passed away 3 months after I was ordained. I often wonder if he regretted his decision." "I don't believe he did." Sarah closed the journal carefully. The entry ends with this: "In giving this man a new path, I believe we do God's work. For who better to guide others from darkness than one who has walked its depths and found the light?" A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window they could see Irish Mike harassing an elderly parishioner, knocking the man's walking stick away. Before Morrison could move, Sheriff Wade appeared, his hand on his gun. "That's enough," Wade's voice carried clearly through the window. "The streets to be cleared by order of the law." Irish Mike sneered but backed away, helping the old man retrieve his stick with exaggerated politeness. The message was clear. Turner's men would respect the law for now, but they were eager for violence. "They're trying to provoke you," Sarah observed, watching Morrison check the peacemaker's action one final time. "To make you draw first, to prove you're still a killer." "I know." Morrison's voice was heavy with understanding. "Just as I once provoked others, thinking I was serving justice by forcing their true natures into the light." He stood, the weapon disappearing beneath his cassock. "The irony would be amusing if it weren't so tragic." Sarah stepped closer, her hand hovering near his arm, but not quite touching. "You don't have to face him. We could send for the marshal. Or you could leave town until..." "Until what?" Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. "Until Turner kills someone else to draw me out? Until another community suffers for my past? No, Miss Mackenzie, some debts can only be paid in person." "Then at least tell me, are you going to kill him?" Morrison moved to the window, watching as the townspeople began clearing the streets. The sun hung heavy in the western sky, a reminder that time flowed only one direction, toward judgment. 10 years ago, I would have known the answer without hesitation. Now, he touched the cross at his throat. Now I pray for guidance and trust that when the moment comes, I will choose correctly. And if he kills you instead, then I die, as I have lived these past 10 years, trying to be better than what I was." Morrison turned to her, his eyes carrying a warmth that belied the cold calculation beneath. "But Miss Mackenzie, you should know. In all my years as the Confessor, I never once fired first, yet here I stand." The implications of those words hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah understood. Morrison had allowed his targets to draw first, yet had emerged alive from every encounter. It wasn't mercy that had stayed his hand, but a deeper, more terrible skill. As if reading her thoughts, Morrison added softly, "The hardest lesson I learned as the Confessor wasn't how to kill. It was understanding that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is let a man draw first, knowing exactly how it will end." Sheriff Wade found Marcus Hawkins alone behind the Long Branch saloon, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and watching the gathering storm clouds. The experienced gunman acknowledged the lawman's approach with a slight nod, his weathered face betraying concern that surprised Wade. "You've seen men face death before, Hawkins," Wade observed, leaning against the weathered wall, "but something about this situation has you troubled." Hawkins exhaled a stream of smoke, considering his words carefully. "In my line of work, Sheriff, you learn to read men, to see the difference between those who wear violence like a fancy coat and those who carry it in their bones." He crushed the cigarette beneath his boot. "Turner doesn't understand what he's walking into." "And you do?" "I was in Dodge City that day," Hawkins revealed, his voice dropping. "Didn't participate, mind you. Just watched from the Silver Dollar Saloon as the Confessor faced down Matthew Turner and his gang. 12 men, all killers, all drawing first." He shook his head slowly. "What happened next? I've never seen anything like it." Wade studied the gunman carefully. "Tell me." "The Confessor never moved until they drew, gave each man a chance to walk away. But once the first gun cleared leather—" Hawkins paused, remembering. It wasn't just speed. It was like he could read their intentions before they moved. 12 men, 12 shots, all precise. Some died, some lived, but every bullet found exactly the spot he intended. Thunder rolled in the distance as Wade processed this information. And Matthew Turner, last man standing, reached for something. We all thought it was his gun. The Confessor's bullet took him clean through the heart. Hawkins straightened, meeting Wade's gaze. "But here's what haunts me. Before Turner hit the ground, I saw what he was reaching for, just like his brother said, a pocket watch, gold one with his wife's picture inside." The implications hung heavy in the air. Wade broke the silence. "You think Morrison knew?" "I think the Confessor was too good to make that kind of mistake," Hawkins replied grimly. "I think something in him wanted Turner dead, justified or not. That's what makes today different. Morrison spent 10 years trying to be better than the Confessor, but Turner's determined to prove a man can't outrun his nature." The conversation was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Irish Mike appeared around the corner, his young face flushed with whiskey and anticipation. "Boss wants you, Hawkins. Says it's time to discuss positions for sunset." Hawkins pushed away from the wall, giving Wade a meaningful look. "You should know, Sheriff. Turner's not planning to face Morrison alone. He's got something planned, something he says will guarantee the Confessor shows his true colors." Wade's hand moved to his gun belt. "That would be unwise. Very unwise." "Yes," Hawkins agreed quietly. "It would." He turned to follow Irish Mike, then paused. "Sheriff, when it happens, and we both know it will, make sure the street's clear. What's coming? It ain't something decent folks should have to witness." As Hawkins disappeared around the corner, Wade remained in the alley, considering his options. The law was clear about interfering in formal challenges, but Turner's planned treachery changed matters. He found himself wondering if Morrison already anticipated such betrayal, if the priest's apparent serenity masked tactical preparations honed by years of violent encounters. The sheriff's contemplation was interrupted by Sarah Mackenzie's arrival. Her face showed signs of recent tears, but her voice was steady. "Sheriff, Father Morrison asked me to give you a message. He said to tell you, when it begins, watch the shadows, not the light." Wade's expression tightened as he recognized the warning for what it was. Morrison expected Turner's men to take up hidden positions, to turn a formal challenge into an ambush. The priest wasn't just preparing for a duel, he was preparing for war. "Miss Mackenzie," Wade said carefully, "I think it's best if you gather any remaining parishioners and take them to the schoolhouse. Whatever happens at sunset, the church may not be the safest place to seek sanctuary." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "Sheriff, if you knew what was coming, would you try to stop it?" Wade watched as the first drops of rain began to fall, spotting the dusty street with dark promises of what was to come. Some things, once set in motion, can't be stopped. All we can do is pray that when the dust settles, we can live with what remains. The clock in the church tower struck 4, each bone-deep toll a reminder that time was running out for all of them. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Redemption Springs, Turner stood before the mirror in his hotel room, methodically checking his equipment. His ivory-handled revolver had been cleaned 3 times since morning, each bullet in his gun belt inspected for imperfections. Such attention to detail had kept him alive through countless confrontations, though none had carried the weight of what was to come. A knock at the door interrupted his preparations. "Enter," he called, not turning from the mirror. Irish Mike slipped inside, closing the door quickly behind him. "Everything's arranged, boss," the young gunman reported. "Jackson's got the roof of the general store, Watson's in the livery stable, and Hawkins will take position behind the water trough." Mike's voice carried a note of uncertainty, though Hawkins ain't happy about it. Turner adjusted his gun belt, ensuring the holster sat at precisely the right height. "Hawkins doesn't need to be happy. He just needs to follow orders when the time comes." He turned to face Mike, his expression cold. "And what about our insurance policy?" "Taken care of," Mike confirmed, "though I still don't understand why we need... Because, my young friend, legends are built on memorable moments." Turner moved to the window, watching as townspeople hurried to clear the street. The Confessor's legend was built on offering mercy, on giving men a chance to repent before he killed them. Today, we're going to show everyone that his mercy was always a lie. A commotion in the street drew their attention. Sarah Mackenzie was helping elderly Mrs. Peterson toward the schoolhouse, while one of Turner's men watched from the shadows. Turner's thin smile carried no warmth. "You're certain about the girl?" "She visits his church every day, usually stays late talking with him," Mike reported. "The whole town knows she's sweet on him, even if he's too holy to notice." "Perfect." Turner returned to the mirror, making minute adjustments to his appearance. "When the time comes, make sure she's in position. I want him to see her clearly when he makes his choice." Mike shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, using a woman as bait. It ain't right." Turner's movement was blindingly fast. One moment he was at the mirror, the next he had Mike pressed against the wall, forearm across the young man's throat. "Right? You want to talk about right?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but carried deadly intent. "My brother reached for a pocket watch, a gift from his wife. The Confessor knew it, had to know it, but he shot him anyway. Then knelt beside him, offered a prayer like he was some kind of saint." He released Mike, who slumped against the wall, gasping. "Today isn't about right or wrong, it's about truth. The Confessor thinks he's changed, thinks he's found redemption, but I'm going to prove that deep down, he's still just a killer hiding behind a collar." "And if he doesn't take the bait?" Mike asked, rubbing his throat. Turner's smile returned, colder than before. "Then Miss Mackenzie dies, and he'll know it was his fault. Either way, his precious redemption ends today. A knock at the door announced Hawkins's arrival. The experienced gunman took in the scene. Mike's reddened throat, Turner's barely contained violence, and his face hardened. Streets almost clear, sheriff's making sure of it personally. Excellent. Turner checked his pocket watch. Time to set the stage for our little morality play. He turned to Hawkins, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. I trust you remember your part? Hawkins met Turner's gaze steadily. I remember, though I'm thinking the Confessor won't be as easy to manipulate as you seem to believe. That's where you're wrong, Turner replied, moving to the door. Men like him, they think finding God changes who they are. But when the moment comes, when they have to choose between their precious principles and watching someone innocent die. He patted his gun. Well, that's when the truth comes out. As they descended the hotel stairs, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows. Turner paused, watching dust motes dance in the golden light. You know what the secret is, gentlemen? The real secret to killing a legend? Neither man responded, but Turner continued anyway. You don't just kill the man. You destroy everything he believes about himself first. Make him face what he really is. Then, when you put him down, everyone remembers how he broke at the end. Out in the street, the last townspeople were hurrying to find shelter. Morrison's church stood. Neither man responded, but Turner continued anyway. You don't just kill the man. You destroy everything he believes about himself first. Make him face what he really is. Then, when you put him down, everyone remembers how he broke at the end. Out in the street, the last townspeople were hurrying to find shelter. Morrison's church stood silent, its broken window a dark eye watching the proceedings. Somewhere in the gathering shadows, a deadly game of chess was being played, with an innocent woman's life as the central piece. Thunder rolled again, closer now, as if nature itself was providing accompaniment to the coming drama. Turner took his position in the street, his black clothes making him seem like a shadow given form. Places, gentlemen. Let's go remind the Confessor who he really is. In the deepening shadows of St. Michael's Church, Father Morrison knelt before the altar one final time. The last rays of afternoon sunlight filtered through the broken window, casting his shadow long across the wooden floor. His prayers were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, too heavy to be Sarah Mackenzie's, too measured to be Turner's men. You should be clearing the streets, Sheriff, Morrison said without turning. Sunset's not far off. Wade moved down the center aisle, his spurs marking each step with a metallic chorus. Streets are as clear as they're going to get. Though you should know, Turner's men are taking up positions. Hawkins, Watson, Jackson. They're setting up a crossfire. I know. Morrison rose smoothly, years of practice hiding the stiffness in his joints. Just as I know Turner plans to use Sarah Mackenzie to force my hand. He turned to face Wade, his expression serene despite the weight of his words. He believes threatening an innocent will reveal the Confessor beneath the priest. Wade's hand rested on his gun belt, a lawman's instinctive response to tension. And will it? Morrison moved to the pulpit, running his fingers along the worn wood where he had delivered countless sermons. 10 years ago, when I first came to Redemption Springs, Father Andrews asked me a similar question. He wanted to know if my desire to change was genuine or if I was simply running from my past. What did you tell him? The truth. Morrison's voice carried the weight of memory. That I didn't know. That after Dodge City, after Matthew Turner, I realized I'd become something I never intended. A man who dealt death while pretending to offer salvation. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Father Andrews understood something I didn't at the time. He said that true redemption isn't about erasing who you were, but about choosing who you become. Thunder rolled closer as Wade processed this. Turner's not going to give you that choice. He means to force your hand, to make you become the Confessor again, whether you want to or not. There's always a choice, Sheriff. Morrison reached beneath his cassock, withdrawing the peacemaker. The weapon caught the fading light, its well-maintained surface reflecting the cross on the altar. The question is whether we have the courage to make the right one when the moment comes. Wade watched as Morrison checked the weapon one final time. You know this isn't just about Turner's brother anymore. He's built his whole reputation on killing famous gunmen. Taking down the Confessor would make him a legend. Legends, Morrison said softly, are dangerous things. They make us forget the humanity of those involved. Matthew Turner wasn't just a notch on my gun. He was a man who made terrible choices, but might have changed given the chance. I took that chance from him, convinced my judgment was righteous. The church bells began to toll, marking the quarter hour before sunset. Morrison continued, his voice taking on the cadence of confession. I've spent 10 years trying to atone for that arrogance, trying to offer others the chance at redemption that I denied Matthew Turner, and now his brother comes, not seeking justice, but wanting to prove that change is impossible. And what will you prove him right? Wade asked quietly. The Confessor wasn't wrong to stand against evil. He was wrong to believe that death was the only answer to it. Even if it cost Sarah Mackenzie her life. Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a glimpse of the steel beneath the serenity. Sarah is under God's protection, Sheriff, as are all who seek sanctuary in this church. His voice carried absolute conviction. Turner believes threatening an innocent will force me to choose between being a priest and being the Confessor. He doesn't understand that these past 10 years haven't been about denying what I am. They've been about learning to use those skills in service of something greater. The bells tolled again, closer to judgment. Morrison straightened his collar, a priest's gesture performed with a gunfighter's precision. It's time, Sheriff. Clear the street, protect the innocent, and remember, whatever happens out there, it's not about who I was or who Turner wants me to be. It's about who I choose to be in this moment. Wade moved toward the door, then paused. And who is that, Father? Morrison's smile was gentle, but carried echoes of the Confessor's deadly certainty. A shepherd protecting his flock from wolves. God will sort out the rest. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting Redemption Springs in shades of amber and crimson. Sarah Mackenzie stood at the schoolhouse window, watching as the last townspeople hurried to find shelter from the coming storm, both natural and man-made. A hand on her shoulder made her turn. It was Irish Mike, his young face twisted with guilt and determination. Miss Mackenzie, he said softly, you need to come with me now. Boss's orders. Sarah's heart quickened, but her voice remained steady. So this is Turner's plan? Use me to force Father Morrison's hand? She studied Mike's face, seeing the conflict there. You don't have to do this. No, ma'am, I do. Mike's grip tightened slightly. Because if you don't come willing, Jackson up there on the roof has orders to start shooting into the schoolhouse. Lot of children still inside. The implied threat hung heavy in the air. Sarah glanced at the children gathered in the next room, then back to Mike. You're better than this, she said quietly. Father Morrison would tell you there's always a choice. Maybe in church, Mike replied, but his voice wavered. Out here, choices get people killed. He guided her toward the door, trying to be gentle despite his orders. Please, Miss Mackenzie, don't make this harder than it has to be. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder. Sheriff Wade watched from the shadows of the jail as Sarah was led into the street, his hand tight on his gun belt. He'd spotted Turner's men taking their positions, Hawkins behind the water trough, Watson in the livery stable, Jackson on the roof. A perfect crossfire, if it came to that. In the church, Morrison sensed the movement of Sarah being brought out. His hand stilled on his Bible as he offered one final prayer, not for victory, but for wisdom. The weight of the peacemaker beneath his cassock seemed heavier than usual, a reminder of choices past and choices to come. Turner stood in the center of the street, his black clothes making him seem like a piece of the gathering darkness. "Come out, Confessor," he called, his voice carrying in the still air. "Time to show everyone what kind of man really hides behind that collar." Morrison stepped out of the church, his movements measured and calm. The setting sun cast his shadow long before him, a dark path leading to judgment. His eyes took in everything: Sarah's position, Turner's stance, the glint of gun barrels in the shadows. The tableau was arranged exactly as he'd expected. "Let her go, Turner," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of both priest and gunman. "Your quarrel is with me." Turner's smile was cold as winter. "Oh, but this is about you, about the choices you make when innocent lives hang in the balance." He gestured, and Mike pushed Sarah forward, holding her firmly. "You see, I've spent 10 years thinking about that day in Dodge City, about how the Confessor built his legend on giving men a choice before he killed them. And now you want to prove that mercy was a lie." Morrison took another step forward, the boards of the church steps creaking beneath his feet. "That it was just another way to justify killing. I want the truth." Turner's composure cracked slightly. "My brother was reaching for a pocket watch. You had to know that, had to see it. But you shot him anyway, then knelt and prayed over him like some kind of saint." His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "Today, everyone's going to see what you really are." Sarah struggled against Mike's grip. "Father, don't listen to him. He's trying to—" "Be still," Turner snapped, then smoothed his voice. "Unless you want Jackson to start demonstrating his marksmanship on the schoolhouse windows." Morrison's expression remained serene, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle change that made Hawkins tighten his grip on his rifle. "I was wrong that day in Dodge City," Morrison said clearly. "Wrong to play judge, jury, and executioner. Wrong to believe that dealing death was the same as delivering justice." "Pretty words," Turner sneered, "but let's put them to the test." He drew his gun with lightning speed, pressing it against Sarah's temple. "Drop your gun belt in the dirt, Confessor. Show us all how much you've changed." The street fell silent, save for the distant rumble of thunder. Morrison's right hand hung near his hidden peacemaker, while his left touched the cross at his throat. "There's always a choice, Turner, always a chance for redemption, even now." "The only choice," Turner replied, cocking his weapon, "is whether the schoolteacher dies quick or slow. Now drop the gun belt, or we'll find out just how much your new faith is worth." Morrison's eyes met Sarah's, and in that moment a silent understanding passed between them. The game Turner wanted to play had rules the gunman didn't understand, rules written not in blood and gunpowder, but in mercy and sacrifice. Morrison's hands moved slowly, deliberately, to his concealed peacemaker. The weapon emerged into the dying sunlight, its blued steel catching the last golden rays. With careful precision, he placed it on the church steps, the handle pointing away from him in a gesture of submission. "There!" Turner called out, his voice carrying a note of triumph. "The mighty Confessor laying down his arms. Not so righteous when innocent lives hang in the balance, are you?" "Righteousness was never my strength," Morrison replied calmly. "That was always my weakness, believing I had the right to decide who lived and who died." He straightened, hands raised slightly. "But today isn't about righteousness. It's about choice." Turner's grip on his weapon tightened. "The only choice you have is watching her die, or dying yourself. My brother didn't get any choice in Dodge City." "Your brother made his choices long before we met," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the silent street. Just as you're making yours now, threatening school children, using an innocent woman as a shield. You're not seeking justice, Turner. You're becoming everything you claim to hate about me." Sarah, still held firmly by Irish Mike, watched the exchange with growing understanding. Morrison wasn't just talking. He was positioning himself, drawing attention to his apparent helplessness, while his eyes mapped every shadow, every potential threat. "Shut up." Turner's composure cracked further. "You don't get to judge me. Not after what you did." He pressed the gun harder against Sarah's temple, making her wince. "Take off the collar. Show everyone what you really are." Morrison's fingers moved to his clerical collar, unfastening it with the same care he'd shown the weapon. "You know, Turner, there's something your brother said to me before he died. Something I've carried these past 10 years. "More lies," Turner spat, but there was uncertainty in his voice. He said, "We deserve what's coming, but please not the girl." Morrison's eyes locked with Turner's. He wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about his pregnant wife back in Wichita. The one who died waiting for him to return from that last robbery. The revelation hit Turner like a physical blow. His gun hand trembled slightly. "You're lying. Matthew never—" "Check the pocket watch you're so fond of mentioning," Morrison suggested quietly. "The one he was reaching for. Inside the case, behind the picture, there's an inscription. 'To our future, with love.'" He was trying to look at it one last time. Thunder cracked overhead as Turner processed this information, his face contorted with conflicting emotions, rage, doubt, grief. "It doesn't matter," he managed finally. "You still shot him down, still played judge and executioner." "Yes," Morrison acknowledged. "I did, and I've spent every day since then trying to be better than the man who made that choice." He took a step forward, hands still raised. "Just as you can be better than this moment, James, better than threatening children and innocent women." Irish Mike's grip on Sarah had loosened slightly as he listened to the exchange. In the shadows, Hawkins shifted uncomfortably, his rifle lowering a fraction. The tableau Morrison had read so carefully was beginning to fracture. "Boss!" Hawkins called out, his voice carrying worry. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Turner's composed facade shattered completely. "All of you shut up. This ends today. The Confessor dies one way or another." His gun swung from Sarah toward Morrison. "On your knees, priest. Time for your last confession." Morrison knelt slowly, his movement drawing all eyes. "I confess," he said clearly, "that I have sinned, that I have taken life when I should have preserved it, that I have judged when judgment belonged to God alone." His voice carried to every corner of the street. "But I also confess that redemption is possible, that mercy isn't weakness, and that even now, in this moment, there is a choice." The sun touched the horizon, painting the scene in deep shadows and bloody light. Sarah felt Irish Mike's grip loosen further as the young man wrestled with his conscience. Above them, Jackson's rifle barrel wavered uncertainly. Even Hawkins had lowered his weapon, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. "Enough!" Turner's voice cracked like the approaching thunder. "No more sermons, no more chances. Time to show everyone that the Confessor was just a killer in priest's clothing." His finger tightened on the trigger. But in that moment, as the sun cast its final rays across Redemption Springs, something had shifted. The carefully orchestrated execution had become something else, a test not of Morrison's faith, but of every man's capacity for change. The first drops of rain began to fall as Turner's finger tightened on the trigger. Each moment stretched like eternity, filled with the weight of choices made and yet to be made. Morrison remained kneeling, his posture speaking not of surrender but of certainty, his eyes never leaving Turner's face. "You won't find what you're looking for in revenge, James," Morrison said softly, using Turner's given name with deliberate care. Your brother understood that at the end. It's why he reached for the watch instead of his gun. Stop talking about him. Turner's hand shook visibly now, the weapon wavering between Morrison and Sarah. You don't get to speak his name. You don't get to pretend you knew him. But I did know him in those final moments. Morrison's voice carried the weight of memory. Known him better than perhaps anyone. A man's true nature reveals itself when he faces death. Matthew chose to die thinking of love, not hatred. Can you say the same about how you've chosen to live? The rain began falling harder, drops striking the dust like bullets, creating a thin mist that made the scene seem almost dreamlike. Irish Mike's grip on Sarah had become uncertain, his young face twisted with internal conflict. Above them, Jackson lowered his rifle completely, unable to maintain his aim as Morrison's words struck home. "Boss!" Hawkins called out, his voice carrying above the growing storm. "This ain't right. Using a woman as a shield, threatening children. This ain't justice. This is everything we used to hunt men down for." Turner's composure cracked further. "Shut up. All of you just shut up." His gun swung wildly between targets. The Confessor dies today. That's all that matters. That's all that's ever mattered. "Is it?" Morrison asked quietly. "Is that what Matthew would want? His brother becoming the very thing he died trying to escape?" He rose slowly from his kneeling position, his movements deliberate and calm. "Your brother's last words weren't a curse or a plea. They were a prayer for your soul, James. He knew what vengeance would do to you." Sarah felt Irish Mike's grip loosen further as the young man's resolve wavered. The rain had soaked them all now, washing away the dust of the day, revealing the truth beneath the surface. She caught Morrison's eye and saw the subtle nod, a signal she understood from years of watching him guide troubled souls to better choices. "Mike," she said softly, turning slightly to face her captor, "you're not a killer. None of this is who you are." The young gunman's face crumpled with the weight of conscience. His hands fell away from Sarah entirely as he stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't, boss. This ain't right, the priest. He's been nothing but kind to everyone, even them that don't deserve it." Turner's control of the situation was unraveling like a poorly woven thread. His careful plan to force the Confessor to reveal his true nature had instead revealed the nature of everyone else. One by one, his men were choosing mercy over violence, redemption over revenge. "Cowards!" Turner's voice cracked like the thunder overhead. "All of you! He killed my brother in cold blood, and you're letting his pretty words blind you to what he really is." "No, James." Morrison took another step forward, rain running down his face like tears. "They're seeing clearly for the first time. Seeing that violence only breeds more violence, that revenge is a poison that kills the soul before it kills the body." He spread his hands wide, offering himself as a target. "If you need to kill me to find peace, then do it. But do it facing me, man to man, not hiding behind innocent lives." Sarah took advantage of her freedom to move away from Turner, but instead of running to safety, she positioned herself between him and the schoolhouse. Her actions spoke louder than words, a demonstration of the very principles Morrison had been teaching. "You see?" Turner's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Even now, you're manipulating everyone, making them think you're some kind of saint when you're just a killer in priest's clothing." "No," Morrison replied with absolute conviction. "I'm a killer who chose to be something better, just as you can choose to be better than this moment." He gestured to his discarded peacemaker on the church steps. "Your brother died reaching for a symbol of love. What will you reach for, James?" The rain continued to fall, washing the street clean, while thunder rolled overhead like the voice of judgment itself. In this moment of truth, every soul in Redemption Springs held its breath, waiting to see which path Turner would choose, the redemption he'd come to destroy or the destruction he'd come to embrace. Lightning split the sky above Redemption Springs, illuminating the tableau below in stark relief. The flash caught every detail of the scene, the rain-soaked street turning to mud, the tense faces watching from shadowed windows, the trembling hands on weapons that no one seemed eager to use anymore. In that brilliant moment, Turner's face revealed everything. The decade of pain etched into lines around his eyes, the crumbling certainty in his clenched jaw, the desperate need to believe that revenge could fill the void his brother's death had left. When darkness returned, he was a man stripped bare of pretense, facing truths he'd spent 10 years avoiding. The church's broken window gaped behind Morrison like a dark wound, while overhead, thunder rolled across the territory like God's own judgment. The rain fell harder now, soaking through clothes and washing away the careful masks everyone had worn. Each drop struck the ground with the weight of confession, turning the street's dust into a mirror that reflected back the truth of what each person had become. "You're wrong about him," Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the authority of witness. The experienced gunman stepped away from his hiding place, his rifle pointed at the ground. Rain ran down his weathered face as he moved slowly into the street, positioning himself between Turner and the schoolhouse. "I was there that day in Dodge City. Saw it all from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Your brother didn't die a violent man, Turner. He died trying to change." Turner's gun wavered, his composure cracking like ice in spring. The weapon, so steady in countless confrontations before, shook visibly in his hand. "You're lying. You're all lying." His voice carried the desperate edge of a man watching his world collapse around him. Matthew was a fighter, a survivor. He wouldn't just... He would, Morrison interrupted gently, using the same tone he employed for deathbed confessions, because he'd learned what you haven't, that there are things worth more than survival, than revenge, than being the fastest gun. He took another step forward, rain running down his face like tears. His black cassock clung to him, a reminder of the path he'd chosen after that fateful day. That's what the pocket watch meant. Not just love, but the promise of a different life. Sarah Mackenzie, still standing her ground protecting the schoolhouse, spoke up. The rain had plastered her hair to her face, but her voice remained strong, carrying the conviction of someone who had seen true redemption at work. "Show him, Father. Show him what you've carried all these years." Morrison reached slowly into his cassock, not toward the hidden holster where the peacemaker waited, but toward an inner pocket near his heart. What he withdrew was small, golden, and achingly familiar to Turner. A pocket watch, its case tarnished with age, but still intact. The metal caught the next lightning flash, seeming to glow with its own inner light. "Your brother's last request," Morrison explained, holding it out like an offering of peace. Rain dripped from its chain as he stepped closer to Turner, "that I find a way to get this back to his wife. But when I reached Wichita..." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "She was gone," Turner whispered, the fight draining from his voice like water from a broken vessel. "Died in childbirth 2 days after she heard about Matthew." The words seemed to cost him physically, each one carrying the weight of years of suppressed grief. "Yes." Morrison took another step forward, the watch gleaming dully in the rain. "I've carried it ever since. A reminder of the price of judgment, of the lives we destroy when we choose violence over mercy." He held the watch higher, letting Turner see the inscription inside. The worn engraving caught what little light remained. "To our future, with love." Your brother's last thoughts weren't of hatred or revenge. They were of love and regret, of the future he'd never see. Irish Mike had moved completely away from the conflict now, his young face streaked with rain and tears. The boy who had entered Turner's service seeking adventure and glory now looked sick with the reality of what they'd become. "Boss, maybe we've been wrong about all this." Thunder rolled overhead as Turner's world continued to unravel. His gun hand shook visibly as Morrison approached, one slow step at a time, the pocket watch extended like an olive branch. The street had become a stage where not just lives but souls hung in the balance. Each person there understood they were witnessing something more than just the end of a feud. They were seeing the moment when a man either found redemption or lost himself completely. "He was reaching for this," Turner said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Not his gun. All this time, I thought." His finger tightened on the trigger, then loosened as another truth hit him. "I built everything on making you pay, on proving you were just a killer pretending to be holy. But—" He looked around at his men, at the townsfolk watching from windows, at Sarah standing firm to protect the children. "But you're not pretending, are you? No more than your brother was pretending when he chose love over violence in his final moment." Morrison stood within arm's reach now, the watch between them like a bridge across a decade of pain. "The question isn't who I am, James. It's who you choose to be in this moment." Sheriff Wade watched the scene unfold through the curtain of rain, his hand still resting near his gun. Years of law enforcement had taught him to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, the tension in a man's shoulders, the slight shift of weight that came before a draw, the look in the eyes when a soul teetered between choices. What he saw now in Turner's face was something he'd witnessed only rarely, the moment when a man's entire worldview began to crumble. Turner stared at the pocket watch Morrison held out, his gun hand trembling visibly now. The weapon that had seemed so certain in his grip moments ago now appeared to weigh as much as all his years of hatred. Lightning flashed again, catching the golden surface of the watch, and in that brief illumination, Wade saw tears mixing with the rain on Turner's face. "I remember the day Matthew bought this," Turner said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Spent 3 months' earnings from honest work, the last honest work he ever did. Said he was going to build something real, something that would last." His laugh held no humor, only pain. 2 weeks later, he was riding with Jackson's gang, saying he needed money faster than any honest job could provide. Morrison kept the watch extended, letting it serve as a bridge between them. "Your brother made mistakes, James, terrible ones, but in his final moments, he remembered who he wanted to be, not who he had become." The priest's voice carried the weight of witness. "That's why I've carried this all these years, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that redemption is possible, even in our darkest moments." Sarah Mackenzie, still standing guard before the schoolhouse, spoke up. "It's not too late, Mr. Turner. Father Morrison has shown us all that the past doesn't have to define who we become." Thunder rolled across the sky like distant artillery, and Turner's gun wavered again. "I've killed 11 men since Matthew died," he confessed, the words spilling out like the rain. "Each time, I told myself it was justice, that I was cleaning up the territories, just like the Confessor used to do." His eyes met Morrison's. "But that wasn't true, was it? I just wanted to feel powerful, to believe I could control something in a world that took everything from me." Hawkins had moved closer, his own weapon now slung across his back. "Boss, I've ridden with you for 3 years. Seen you do things that needed doing. Seen you show mercy when others wouldn't. But this—" He gestured to the schoolhouse, to Sarah, to the watching town. "This ain't justice. This is just pain, looking for more pain to keep it company." The rain continued to fall, each drop carrying the weight of confession. Irish Mike, the youngest of Turner's men, had backed completely away from the conflict now, his face showing the dawning realization of what they had become. Even Jackson, still positioned on the roof but no longer aiming his rifle, seemed to be wrestling with truths long denied. Morrison took another step forward, close enough now that Turner could see every detail of the watch's worn surface. "Your brother's last words weren't about revenge, James. They were a prayer, not for himself, but for you. He asked God to help you find a better path than the one he'd chosen. Turner's gun lowered fractionally, then raised again as another wave of emotion hit him. "I wanted to hate you," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Needed to hate you. Because if you were just a killer, if your redemption was a lie, then—" He struggled with the words. "Then maybe there was no other way. Maybe violence was all any of us could ever be. But you've seen different," Morrison pressed gently. "Seen men choose mercy over vengeance, seen killers become protectors, seen that change is possible." He held the watch higher. "Your brother understood this in his final moments. That's why he reached for love instead of his gun. The question now is, what will you reach for?" The moment stretched like an eternity, heavy with the weight of choice. In the distance, the church bell began to toll, marking the hour with deep, resonant notes that seemed to penetrate to the soul. Each toll carried the weight of judgment, counting down the seconds until Turner's decision would reshape not just his life, but the lives of everyone watching. "All these years," Turner whispered, rain running down his face like tears, "I've been trying to keep Matthew's memory alive through violence. But that's not who he was trying to become, was it? Not who he wanted me to be." Morrison's response was gentle but firm. "The greatest honor we can show the dead is to learn from their final truths. Your brother died reaching for love, James. What will you choose to reach for?" The rain fell steadily over Redemption Springs, its rhythm marking time like a priest counting rosary beads. Turner stood frozen in the middle of the street, his gun still raised but wavering, as the full weight of a decade's misunderstanding crashed over him like the storm above. The pocket watch in Morrison's outstretched hand caught occasional flashes of lightning, each brief illumination revealing another layer of truth too long denied. "I remember the day Matthew told me he was going straight," Turner spoke, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "I laughed at him, called him soft, said he was fooling himself if he thought a man could change his nature." His gun hand trembled visibly now. "But he wasn't the fool, was he? I was." Morrison maintained his steady gaze, neither advancing nor retreating. The watch between them had become more than a mere object. It was a bridge across years of hatred, a symbol of choices made and yet to be made. "Your brother understood something that took me years to learn, James. Our nature isn't fixed by our past actions, it's determined by our present choices." Sheriff Wade observed the scene with the practiced eye of a lawman who had seen countless confrontations reach their breaking point. But this was different. The tension in the air wasn't the familiar pressure before violence erupted. It was the strange, electric feeling of transformation, of souls being weighed in the balance. Sarah Mackenzie, still standing guard before the schoolhouse, spoke again. "Mr. Turner, I've watched Father Morrison these past 10 years. Watched him struggle with who he was and who he wanted to be. Every day, he chose mercy over violence, peace over power, not because it was easy, but because it was right." A distant roll of thunder punctuated her words, and Turner's expression shifted. The hatred that had sustained him for so long began to crack like ice in spring, revealing depths of pain and loss he'd tried to bury beneath revenge. "I've killed men," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Killed them and called it justice. Told myself I was cleaning up the territories, just like the Confessor used to do. But every time I pulled the trigger, I wasn't thinking about justice. I was trying to kill the pain inside me." Hawkins stepped forward, his weathered face showing understanding born of similar experiences. "Boss, I've seen men lose themselves to revenge, seen what it does to a soul. But I've also seen men find their way back. The Confessor did it. Your brother was trying to do it. Maybe it's time." "Time for what?" Turner demanded, though the question held more desperation than anger now. "Time to pretend the past never happened. Time to play at being something I'm not." Morrison's response was gentle but firm. "No, James. Time to honor your brother's final choice. Time to reach for something better than revenge." He held the watch higher, letting another flash of lightning catch its surface. Matthew died trying to change, died thinking not of hatred or violence, but of love and possibility. The question isn't whether change is possible. Your brother proved it was. The question is whether you have the courage to follow his example. The words seemed to strike Turner like physical blows. His gun lowered slightly, then raised again, as he wrestled with truths too long denied. The rain continued to fall, soaking through clothes and washing away the carefully constructed facades that had protected damaged souls from honest reflection. Irish Mike, watching from the sidelines, suddenly spoke up. "He's right, boss. We all joined up thinking we were bringing justice to the territories, but somewhere along the way, we became what we used to hunt." The young gunman's face showed the dawning horror of self-recognition. Using children as threats, holding an innocent woman hostage. We're not the good guys anymore. Turner's breath caught audibly at these words. His eyes moved from face to face. Morrison's calm certainty, Sarah's steadfast courage, Hawkins's growing understanding, Mike's youthful realization. Each expression reflected back a truth he'd been running from since that day in Dodge City. "Matthew never wanted this for you," Morrison said softly, taking another careful step forward. In his final moments, when he reached for this watch instead of his gun, he was choosing a different path, not just for himself, but as an example. The priest's voice carried absolute conviction. Your brother died trying to be better than his past. The question now is, will you live to honor that choice or die denying it? The storm above seemed to hold its breath. Thunder momentarily stilled as Turner faced the crossroads of his soul. The gun in his hand had never felt heavier, weighted now not just with metal, but with the burden of every choice that had led him to this moment. A profound silence fell over Redemption Springs, broken only by the steady drumming of rain. Turner's gun hand trembled visibly as he stared at the pocket watch in Morrison's outstretched hand. The golden timepiece caught another flash of lightning, and in that brief illumination, something in Turner's eyes changed. A shift from vengeful certainty to devastating understanding. "I remember the last time I saw Matthew alive," Turner spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "He tried to tell me something, but I wouldn't listen. Said he'd found something worth more than gold or reputation." His gun lowered fractionally. "I told him he was going soft, that men like us didn't get second chances." Morrison maintained his steady pose, the watch extended like an offering of peace. "Your brother understood something that took me years to learn, James. Second chances aren't given. They're chosen, every day, with every decision we make." Sheriff Wade observed the transformation occurring before him with the careful attention of a man who had seen both redemption and damnation play out on these streets. The tension in the air had shifted from the familiar pressure before violence to something rarer, the electric anticipation of a soul choosing its path. "Tell me something, Confessor," Turner said, using the old name one final time. "That day in Dodge City, did you know? When he reached for the watch instead of his gun, did you know what it was?" Morrison's response carried the weight of a decade's reflection. "I knew it wasn't a weapon, knew he was reaching for something personal, something precious." He paused, letting the truth settle between them like the rain. "But I pulled the trigger anyway, because in that moment I wasn't serving justice. I was playing God. That's the sin I've spent 10 years trying to atone for." Sarah Mackenzie, still standing guard before the schoolhouse, spoke with quiet conviction. "That's why he became a priest, Mr. Turner. Not to hide from his past, but to ensure it taught him something worth passing on." The rain continued to fall, each drop carrying the weight of memory and choice. Turner's gun hand lowered further as he wrestled with truths too long denied. "All these years," he said, his voice breaking, "I've been telling myself I was honoring Matthew's memory. That every man I killed in the name of revenge was a step closer to justice. He looked around at the town, at the faces watching from windows and doorways. But I wasn't honoring him at all, was I? I was betraying everything he died trying to become. Hawkins stepped forward, his experience-worn face showing understanding. Boss, I've seen men lose their souls to revenge. Seen what it does to them piece by piece, but I've also seen men find their way back. He gestured toward Morrison. The Confessor did it. Your brother was trying to do it. Maybe it's time. Time for what? Turner demanded, though the question held more desperation than anger. Time to forget what happened? Time to pretend the past doesn't matter? Morrison's response was gentle but firm. No, James. Time to honor your brother's final choice. Time to understand that the greatest tribute we can pay to the dead is to learn from their last truths. He held the watch higher. Matthew died reaching for love instead of violence. The question isn't whether change is possible. Your brother proved it was. The question is whether you have the courage to follow his example. Turner's breath caught audibly at these words. His eyes moved from face to face, Morrison's calm certainty, Sarah's steadfast courage, Hawkins's growing understanding. Each expression reflected back a truth he'd been running from since that day in Dodge City. The storm above seemed to hold its breath as Turner faced the crossroads of his soul. The gun in his hand had never felt heavier, weighted now not just with metal, but with the burden of every choice that had led him to this moment. I've spent 10 years building a reputation, Turner said softly, speaking more to himself than the others. Built it on death and revenge, telling myself it was justice, telling myself I was becoming something Matthew would be proud of. His laugh held no humor, only recognition. But I wasn't becoming anything. I was just dying in a different way than he did. Morrison took another careful step forward, the watch still extended between them. It's not too late to choose differently, James. Your brother understood that in his final moments. The question is, do you understand it now? Thunder rolled overhead like divine commentary as Turner faced the moment of truth that would define not just his future, but his understanding of the past. The gun in his hand represented one path, the familiar road of violence and revenge. The watch in Morrison's outstretched hand offered another, the harder path of redemption and change. The moment of decision stretched like an eternity in the rain-soaked street of Redemption Springs. Turner stood motionless, his gun hand trembling as he stared at the pocket watch in Morrison's outstretched hand. The weight of a decade's misunderstanding hung in the air between them, heavier than the storm clouds overhead. With deliberate slowness, Turner's gun hand began to lower. The movement seemed to cost him physically, as though he were fighting against the gravity of years of hatred and revenge. When he spoke, his voice carried the raw edge of revelation. Matthew used to say that a man's choices make him who he is, Turner said, rain running down his face like tears. I never understood what he meant until now. His gun hand lowered completely, the weapon pointing at the mud-streaked street. All these years I've been choosing death, convincing myself it was justice. But it wasn't justice I was serving. It was my own pain. Morrison maintained his position, the watch still extended between them like a bridge across the years. Your brother understood something at the end that took me years to learn, he said softly. True strength isn't in how many lives we take, but in how many we spare, in the mercy we show when vengeance would be easier. The storm's intensity began to lessen, the heavy rainfall softening to a gentle shower that seemed to wash away more than just the day's dust. Turner looked around at the faces watching from windows and doorways, at Sarah Mackenzie still standing guard before the schoolhouse, at his own men who had chosen conscience over loyalty. I've killed 11 men since Matthew died, Turner admitted, his voice breaking. Each time I told myself I was honoring his memory, building a reputation that would make him proud. He laughed, a sound devoid of humor but full of understanding. But the truth is, I was just running from what he tried to tell me that last day, that there's more to life than being the fastest gun. With movements that seemed to age him decades in moments, Turner knelt in the mud. His gun slipped from his fingers, landing with a soft splash in a puddle that reflected the clearing sky above. "I can't bring him back," he said, looking up at Morrison. "Can't undo what either of us did that day in Dodge City. But maybe I can start choosing differently." Morrison stepped forward, closing the final distance between them. The pocket watch gleamed in his hand as he held it out to Turner. "Your brother's last choice was to reach for love instead of violence. In doing so, he showed us both a better path." Turner's hands shook as he accepted the watch, cradling it like something infinitely precious and fragile. When he opened the case, his breath caught audibly. Inside, behind the photograph of Matthew's wife, was the inscription he'd never seen: "To our future, with love." "He really was trying to change," Turner whispered, understanding finally, breaking through completely. "And I've spent 10 years dishonoring that choice with every trigger I pulled." Sheriff Wade stepped forward, his stance cautious but hopeful. "It's not too late to make different choices, Turner. The law will have its say about past actions, but mercy exists there too, for those who seek it honestly." Morrison extended his hand to help Turner rise. "The hardest sermon I ever gave," he said quietly, "was about forgiveness. Not because forgiveness is complicated, but because true forgiveness requires us to see ourselves and others clearly, without the shadows of pride or hatred." Turner grasped Morrison's hand, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. The pocket watch remained clutched in his other hand, its weight now a reminder of possibility rather than vengeance. As he stood, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across Redemption Springs, but also illuminating paths forward that had been hidden in darkness. "What happens now?" Turner asked, sounding more lost than dangerous. "Now," Morrison replied with gentle certainty, "we honor your brother's memory by choosing the path he tried to show us. It won't be easy. Real change never is. But it begins with a single choice, followed by another and another." Sarah Mackenzie moved from her position by the schoolhouse, approaching the two men. "That's what Father Morrison has taught us all these years," she said. "That redemption isn't a single moment of revelation, but a journey of daily choices." The town seemed to exhale collectively as the tension of years finally dissipated. Hawkins began gathering the discarded weapons, while Irish Mike helped the remaining townsfolk emerge from their shelters. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, ready for new beginnings. Morrison looked at the church's broken window, then at the men before him, one who had found his path to redemption, another just beginning that journey. "There's work to be done," he said simply. "A church to repair, wrongs to right, choices to make. But that's what redemption is, the daily work of becoming better than we were." The sun continued to rise over Redemption Springs, casting long shadows that reminded all present of where they had been, while illuminating the paths to where they might yet go. The choice, as always, remained their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.